Welcome to the Whiskey Row History Show. I'm Constable Ron Williams, the Yavapai County Constable for Prescott Precinct, and very proud to hold the exact same office that Virgil Earp held in 1879. With me is my co-host, Bradley G. Courtney.
Thank you.
The Whiskey Row historian, the foremost expert on Whiskey Row and the Great Fire of 1900.
Yes, you got that right.
I got it right. I rehearsed. I rehearsed it.
And Bradley G. Thank
Bradley G. Courtney. The
Much
G is
more
important.
Intellectual. Yes.
Exactly.
Brad.
So before we get into today, we're going to be talking about the origins of Whiskey Row. But before we get into the origins, I do want to expound on Bradley is the foremost expert on the origins of Whiskey Row and the Great Fire of 1900 because nobody else had done the research.
Exactly. And I actually, when I started the research on Whiskey Row, which I'll get into why, but I actually started with the Great Fire of 1900 because I knew something about it. But then I went all the way back to the very first newspaper. So what you hear today is going to be the result of actually going back to the very first newspaper. In 1864, I forget the month, the Arizona Miner, which was run by Secretary of Territory Richard McCormick. He owned it. And I went through every newspaper right up through 1902, so found a bunch of really cool stuff. So we're just doing origins today.
Yeah. And one thing I find I find humorous always is that Bradley, you came here you moved up here permanently in 2012, right?
2012.
In 2012. Yeah. And, like everybody else in Prescott, Bradley was, enamored by the history of Whiskey Row, and he wanted to read the books, the real history on Whiskey Row. And he found out that nobody had actually written any books on the history, any scholarly books at least. A lot of the history for Whiskey Row was anecdotal. A lot of it was passed down through families, long-term families, and there wasn't any real scholarly research. But so Bradley, you had to write the book you wanted to read.
And I've had people say to me after the book came out, "What new do you have to add?" I'm going, "Well, everything." And they too thought there'd be books about Whiskey Row history because there's so many stories. And I thought the stories would be in some form of a book. But there were books about the history of Prescott, and Whiskey Row was mentioned, but so much of it was just stories that you heard on the row.
And actually gets us right into our opening segment of Whiskey Row and what is Whiskey Row and what does it mean to Prescott?
Well, when I first began, I moved here in 2011 part-time out in the forest in Ponderosa Park. And in 2012, I learned I could retire, which was so great. And I had made up my mind before that at some point to write this book about Whiskey Row history, thinking it'd be one great big book, but then a publisher came along and that could do it in a series, kind of. It's not really a series, but in four segments. Segments. But now it's up to 5 books. But when I started researching, and I had a master's in history, I was working on my master's thesis into a book, but when I started researching Prescott's history, I went, holy cow, I've hit gold. This is where everything started, and the history's just amazing. So what is Whiskey Row? Whiskey Row was the heart and soul of, Prescott's the heart and soul of historical Arizona. So since saloons were the social hubs of the Old West, and Whiskey Row had this line of these social hubs. I call Whiskey Row at the time in 1860s and then into the 1870s the social center of Arizona Territory. Because
and I would like to actually just elaborate on that for those who may not know. So the saloon at least in Arizona, but really through the West, was not like you said, the social hub of the territory of the town, but it was really the political hub. Men voted at the saloons. Mm-hmm. Men, shared news. They politicked in the saloons. They shared the news of the day. They made their business plans in the saloons. They traded money in the saloons.
Old-fashioned networking.
Networking. It was the social, political, and economic hub of any town because that's where everything happened.
Right, and I call what Beale Street is to Memphis or Bourbon Street to New Orleans, Montezuma Street is the same thing for Prescott. But At first, Whiskey Row was more of an area. It wasn't exactly just on Montezuma. It kind of spread out. So what was Whiskey Row was kind of a general area at the time, and we'll get into that part.
Whiskey Splat,
Whiskey Row here and there. We got a row here, we got a row there.
Okay, so it obviously it's the heart and soul of Prescott. When is the first time it was actually ever mentioned as Whiskey Row?
Yeah, that part's interesting because Prescott was a new town, and they wanted to attract families. They wanted to attract good people, but
good luck in Arizona in 1860s.
Yeah, but as you can imagine, maybe some people have some experience with this. Whiskey sometimes is at the heart of certain problems. Whiskey can cause problems.
Really?
And I've
been a cop for over 20 years, and I don't see it.
I was just told that. I heard that from somebody. I can name a few people, but I won't. But the first time Whiskey Row appeared in print was actually for Prescott, was July 6, 1883, after it burned down.
So that's 19 years.
64. Yeah, I guess so.
19 years after Prescott's founded is the first time it's officially in newspaper labeled as Whiskey Row.
Now that's a Prescott newspaper.
A Prescott newspaper.
So Phoenix had a newspaper. I think it was called Phoenix Republican or something like that.
Yes.
But they in 1878 they had some guy up here, and they were talking about the goings on Whiskey Row in Prescott. But Prescott was not proud of having a Whiskey Row because it was the center of many problems. There was one point where there were so many shootings, guns going off all the time. There was lawlessness, and this is after we lost the capital of Tucson. So in 67 through the early 70s, there were so many problems that actually some people were afraid that will we continue to exist since we're not the capital anymore. But it was just lawless. And then some lawmen came around, and one James Dodson especially came along and kind of tamed it. But he's an episode in itself.
So Prescott was essentially embarrassed by Whiskey Row?
Yeah. So we had on Cortez, a lot of people don't know this, but they would always talk about Office Row, which was on Cortez above the plaza on the east side between Gurley and Willis, was called Office Row. Now we talked about that, but as far as Whiskey Row, and there were two different times it was mentioned in the Phoenix newspaper, and that was interesting because I looked and looked and looked and waited, and finally it burned down July 83. Now it's mentioned.
Yeah, after it's gone.
Yeah, now okay.
Well, maybe we can rebuild something else, but after it was gone, now we'll talk about it in the past tense.
And I will say this: once it was resurrected, all of a sudden the saloons became signs of progress. Actually, our saloons are as good as those in San Francisco. And they talked about, will it return to the glory that was once Whiskey Row? So they changed their mind once these saloons went up that were of better quality. And so that was interesting.
I wonder if that's also because as the town was growing and becoming more established, and it had more to offer than just a bunch of saloons.
Probably.
That now it's okay to talk about them. Now it's okay to embrace them because the town has more than just saloons to talk about. We're more than just a watering hole.
And they brought people. Saloons bring people.
Of course they did.
So
and the stage routes, a lot of them stopped in front of the saloons. That's where they picked up and dropped off people.
They need saloons.
Yeah.
Social hubs.
Yeah.
They were the social hubs.
Well, if I recall correctly, we talked about this previously in the Virgil Earp story, but Jackson Tompkins Saloon was the drop-off and pickup point for the Starline stage route. You bought your ticket there, you picked up there, you dropped off there.
There was mail delivered there too.
And mail was delivered there also. But the Palace later on was also a stage hub, and you could buy a ticket and wait for your stage inside the Palace Saloon.
Yeah, like you say, voting, all kinds of things.
Exactly.
It was the center of great activity, you know.
So we talked about basically how it started. What about some of the earliest saloons?
So the question is, how far back can you take the history of Whiskey Row? You can take it all the way back to 1864. They needed those social hubs, and the very first saloons were actually. Well, let's talk about. I want to talk about the Isaac Goldberg Quartz Rock Saloon legend, because when I started researching Whiskey Row, I found that there were some stories that had become legends. And this particular story is actually the result of two different places, two different men, two different events, but they're true. Somehow they got combined.
And that's somewhat common in history and legends, that stories get mixed and matched together and they become one story.
And unless you go back and just look at
and dissect them.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Plus looking at every newspaper, no one was willing to do that before. So I was even told by historians, how do you do that? I just found it fascinating.
And a quick shout out to Library of Congress, because their Chronicling America is an incredible website of all these old newspapers that you can actually do term searches and word searches for. Right. And they go back to the the founding of the country.
And that was when I was researching in 2000. That was just becoming a thing, being able to research. But I got microfilm and sat in front of the microfilm reader, and so it's right there. So I actually prefer that, because boy, you fish around for some of those newspaper things, and you got your little finger and your mouse going around. But so the story, the Isaac Goldberg legend goes like this. So I'm going to tell you first the legend, what's actually on the sign on Gurley Street on the bridge. They talk about the very first saloon.
And you're talking about the bridge at Granite Street, or the Granite Creek.
Granite Creek, right bridge. Over Granite Creek, the Gurley Street
basically
bridge there.
Basically, what is that, 100, 200 West Gurley Street?
Yeah, it's close. It's the bank, some banks there.
Yeah.
But you drive over there, there's a sign. And what the sign basically says is that the Whiskey Row began because this guy named Isaac Goldberg had a saloon of sorts, and it consisted of a plank of wood supported by 2 barrels of whiskey. And then he had 2 bottles of whiskey. And this is right on Granite. The sign doesn't say where on Granite Creek. It was just on Granite Creek somewhere. And
there wasn't a lot of choices. There was a lot of trees, a river, and a tent, basically.
And it looked a lot different then. But so the story is that he would sell his whiskey from a tin cup, and he had a bartender that was noseless, and he was an AWOL soldier. On the sign,
he was a what?
AWOL.
Oh, AWOL. I heard something different. I'm sorry.
So a little context here. This is 1864. The war is still going on.
Yeah.
And so AWOL, I'll get to the true story in a minute. So, and he was noseless. That was the interesting thing. And some of the legends have that Goldberg was the noseless guy, but we'll see that he's not. So the story is he was on Granite Creek. He would sell his whiskey, and Granite Creek would be running, and they'd either see Granite Creek running, get sick, or they'd go across and fall in. And so that was dangerous. And then,
and let's be honest, Granite Creek on a good day is 3 feet wide and a foot deep.
It rarely rages.
Yeah,
it will, but yeah.
If you have a monsoon season, it'll rage a little bit. But the bottom line is, it dries up in the late winter and early spring until the rains hit again. It's not like you're crossing the Mississippi.
And it was probably running at the time, but I'll get to the true story. Now remember, this is the legend. And it's the combination. And the thing is, on the sign, it says the name of that saloon was the Quartz Rock.
Yeah.
And then they didn't want people dying in Granite Creek, the horrible Granite Creek, just like the Great Colorado River or something like that. They want to have them die
mighty
there.
Granite Creek.
The mighty Granite Creek.
I forded the mighty Granite Creek.
Okay, let me get my boat. I'm going to get my, never mind. But, so the story on the sign goes, and this came from an Arizona Highways edition that I saw. I've tried to trace how this came about, but the story goes that Goldberg goes, I'll move my saloon to Montezuma Street, and that's begat Whiskey Row. That's how Whiskey Row started.
That's the legend.
That's the legend. So let me get to the what really happened there. So what really happened was there was an Isaac Goldberg. And in 1894, he told his story to the Society of Arizona Pioneers, and some of what you just heard is true. So according to him, he did set up a saloon, and sure enough, it was a plank of wood, 2 bottles of whiskey, tin cup, a barrel, and he had a bartender, and he was noseless. Now remember, this is during the Civil War, a lot of Goldberg's clients, patrons were soldiers from Fort Whipple. So you would think that if he was a Union soldier and he was noseless, he would have gone, hey, we found the guy.
We found the guy. Hey, we're looking for Private Noseless. Oh, there he is right there.
Yeah, so he's pretty conspicuous.
Yeah, he's 5 miles or 2 miles down the road.
Remember that noseless guy that ran away? He's over there.
Yeah.
Maybe they just shut up. But I think he was from, he ran away from the
South?
From the Confederate Army. So, yeah, and he said, Goldberg said he sold his whiskey by the dram from a tin cup.
By the
dram.
By the dram.
So a dram
is like a big mug, right?
A dram?
Yes.
A dram is 1/12 of a shot.
A 1/12 of a shot? That's a drop.
It's a splash. It is a splash. So, maybe these guys are, he never said anything about being on the creek, which I'll prove that he actually was. But, and guys falling in and moving to Montezuma Street, that didn't happen. So what happened was, yes, there was a noseless bartender. He did sell his whiskey from a cup, but I found a map in the Charlotte Hall archives that an old pioneer had drawn out of 1864. It was on one of those manila papers that we used in elementary school to draw on.
Yeah.
And it was in pencil, but it was amazingly well preserved. I think they had it laminated or something like that, but it was just amazing. And I think a guy named George Bernard drew it, who owned the Juniper House, which I'll talk about. But so what he did is, instead of moving to Montezuma Street, he partnered with a guy named George Bernard, who had a restaurant on the corner of, it's called the Juniper House. It's on the corner of where City Hall used to be. So that's the southeast corner of Goodwin
and Cortez.
Right there. And we'll show you a picture of what the Juniper House looked like.
And it was just a log cabin, basically?
It was a log cabin. So the story of that was Bernard, they wanted to celebrate the 4th of July, the early Prescottonians, because they were pro-Union. They were actually, these guys that were here were Lincoln appointees, Abraham Lincoln appointees. So they wanted to celebrate the birth of the United States. That was very important to them. So the first thing that happened was a couple saloons were put up. One was called Roundtree Saloon, and it was
the Roundtree.
Yeah, that's the name of the guy, Roundtree.
Oh, his name is
the name of the saloon. I don't think he had a name of the saloon.
It's Roundtree Saloon.
Yeah, his saloon. So he was, and the way it was described, it was primitive too, is that he had a barrel of whiskey, and he had 2 ponderosa pine poles, and he had a covered wagon canvas over the top of it. And this set up for the 4th of July. So they wanted to get, it's almost like a concession, for this event. But the report in the paper said, well, one of the guys said that the whiskey he bought, or whatever it is he bought from those saloons, was, he described it as something like whiskey.
Something like whiskey.
It was something like whiskey. He goes,
could have been turpentine.
It did.
Could have been bleach, but it was something like whiskey.
It did the job. And the paper was like bragging. The miner was bragging to say, hey, we're bad boys too. We were shooting our guns in the air. And he said something about Tucson. Tucson's going to be jealous because we're bad too. We're shooting our guns in the air. The whiskey was doing that. But the Juniper House was set up on that day. And it was more of a restaurant. And apparently there was a juniper tree nearby.
So this log cabin Juniper House, it was expansive, right? It was a giant construction.
Right. And
it was huge.
I'm going to get to that.
Okay.
Yeah, it was a spacious dining hall.
Spacious dining hall.
But Goldberg partnered with George Bernard. I think they had met each other before. And so basically what he was doing was selling his whiskey from the Juniper House. And I wasn't really for that. It just kind of went along with the whole thing. But what happened is that actually the first advertisement was for liquor was Goldberg. He said, I'm selling my stuff out of Juniper House, and it was made sure this is warranted pure. So I'm thinking before that,
it wasn't
the whiskey wasn't too good. It wasn't regulated.
It was unpure and unwarranted.
It could have been, like you said, some turpentine and some gunpowder in there. And he sold it. I want to say this: he sold it by the dram before, and the map. I want to go back to that map. On that map, it shows where his saloon was. So where today's Mile High Middle School is, just like the Virgil Earp thing where the shootout took place. His it was said it was out in the woods, so that was out in the woods comparatively during those times.
And which one was this?
So this was Goldberg's original saloon.
His original saloon
before he moved to the Juniper House.
Oh, okay,
and that's where he told his story. But Bernard drew a little map of it, and you could see it said Prescott's first saloon, so it was right there. So that's how I discovered where it was. Didn't get it in the book because you keep researching, you find out stuff. So
how big was the Juniper House?
It was according to one pioneer, Albert Banta. He had a meal there, and first of all, he said it was spacious. He said inside there was a table. There was ponderosa pine logs sawn in half, long ways. The sawn part up, so the exposed part up.
So you have a flat area.
Flat area. And what happened was when it got warm inside the spacious Juniper House, the sap would come up and they'd get their food stuck in the sap.
It would leach out sap.
So it was a problem. But he goes, your spacious dining hall. Then he described it. It was 12 by 15 feet.
Which is, I think, just slightly smaller than the studio here.
Yeah, you could fit, at the time, it's all relative, I guess. That was spacious. Yeah, at the time I saw that, I went and measured my bedroom, and my bedroom was bigger than that. So
a lot of people's master bedrooms are going to be bigger than that. So you have a juniper log house that's 12 by 15 feet.
Right.
And inside you have a long, essentially picnic table that's made of juniper
ponderosa
pines that are cut with the cut side up for a flat surface. And then when it gets hot, it leaches sap and gets all over your plate and all over your food.
My bread's tasting a little piney right now.
I know. High end. Prescott's first high end establishment.
Well, it was called Prescott's first saloon, and actually in the paper said his first hotel. And
so you slept on the floor after you passed out?
I think he had to sleep outside. I don't know where they would have stayed. It was not a hotel. But the backstory to that is when he was Bernard was building his Juniper House, he had logs brought in, and those were brought in by the Miller brothers from Miller Valley. And apparently they were big old strong boys. And the way he paid them was Bernard was a cook. He paid him in elderberry pies. So
elderberry pies?
We'll do it, but you got to give us some elderberry pies. So that's how things worked back then.
What's the pie to dram conversion rate?
Yeah, you can eat a lot more pie than you can whiskey.
I guess. I don't know. I've seen some people.
Yeah. Yeah, I know. We won't name names.
All righty. So the real story about the Quartz Rock then.
So the Quartz Rock, that was a real place. But Goldberg never gave a name to his operation. But the Quartz Rock I think it gets mixed in there because the Quartz Rock was actually Prescott's first go-to saloon. And there's a story that goes with the opening there. But so the Quartz Rock Saloon was, William Hardy was a really mover and shaker of early Arizona, and he actually set up Hardyville on the Colorado River.
I've been to Hardyville. It's now Fort Mojave. It's south of Bullhead City.
It's considered early Bullhead City.
Yeah, so, and it's if you go down there, the cemetery's still there. That's about all that's left. It's the cemetery up on a hill.
That was probably where the root of it was. But yeah, he's called the founder of Bullhead City because that's an
interesting Prescott Mojave County connection.
So this is before the Capitol was set up. So he was here during the gold rush, kind of a gold rush, people coming out here. So he set up Hardyville on the Colorado River. Eventually set up the Hardyville Toll Road when Prescott was established. But he learned that here's this capital, this new towns being set up to serve as the capital of the territory. And he went in on this. He realized there's going to be a lot of commerce there. So he rushed over from his place, Hardyville, and started building, and the newspapers started going, William Hardy's here. He's building something. We don't know what it is. It was actually two different establishments. And eventually he learned that he was building a saloon. It was going to be the best thing Prescott's ever seen. And he also had a mercantile.
Which it's not hard to do.
What's that?
It's not hard to have the best thing Prescott's ever seen.
Because there wasn't anything else.
When the best thing they had so far was a 12 by 15 pine house that leaked sap everywhere.
And a plankwood.
And a plankwood bar.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So he comes and he starts setting up right about the time when the Courts Rock opens. The first legislative session ended, so that was successful. There were things to celebrate. There was also a wedding we'll talk about. So Courts Rock, I think it opened on it was November 14th or something like that, and Hardy
of 64.
64. So this is into 64. So Hardy announces that there's going to be a grand opening. There's going to be a free drink involved and everything. So here you got these guys. You got Governor Goodwin. You got Richard McCormick. You got officers from
and McCormick is Secretary of State.
Secretary of Territory.
Secretary of Territory.
Yeah. So
you had the governor, the Secretary of Territory.
You got some judges. You got some not congressmen, but legislators, and officers from Fort Whipple, and they form a club. William Berry was a judge. They form a club called the Barbarians. These are
the movers and the shakers. These are the people who formed the territory.
These are good Republicans.
Yeah.
So they call themselves the Barbarians, and their mission, they had a mission. I don't think this club lasted very long, but they had a mission to celebrate. I think they were really celebrating the fact that they completed this first legislative session. And so they wanted to celebrate. They formed the Barbarians, and their mission was to celebrate big happenings.
Okay.
And so a big happening was the Courts Rock Saloon. And it just so happened.
So it was an excuse to drink.
And Hardy may have gone, we're going to open, once this session is done. So it gave these guys a place. And remember, Prescott at the time only had a couple hundred people.
Yeah.
There weren't really people there. So what happened just before that? So the Speaker of the House, I guess they called the House, his name was William Claude Jones. You see a picture of him, even his picture looks kind of like, ew, this guy's, he greased his hair, but he didn't look good. But what happened is William Claude Jones, the day before the Courts Rock opened, got married. And the Barbarians go, hey, we need to have a chivalry and celebrate this. The chivalry was like a mock celebration kind of thing. Well, so the Barbarians get ready and they grab some toys. I don't know what you would call them, sticks and stones and pans and stuff like that to make some noise, because they found out that William Claude Jones, his bride was Caroline Steffens, I think her name was, and she was 15 years old.
She was 15.
She was 15.
Now, okay, granted, social norms back then, you'd have a slightly older man and slightly younger woman than today, but 15 is still on the real early side for even then.
And even those guys were going, this is kind of creepy.
And he was how old roughly?
He was in his 40s at least.
At least his 40s. I've seen the drawing picture and he looks closer to 50.
Yeah, I think he probably was.
I'm not going to say anymore. That just
seems
weird.
Yeah. And we dealt with Josephine Earp with that same
situation, exactly.
But
hey, but at least Johnny was only 30.
Anyway. So they go over to William Claude Jones's house because they want to congratulate the bride and groom. They barge in to the house. Here's the funny part to me. Most of the other guys were prominent, and I don't know what Governor Goodwin was thinking, but the newspaper reported that Governor Goodwin was hiding in a bush. And you see a picture of him. He's a big fella. He's hiding in a bush, beating on a pan or something like that, hiding from the paparazzi. I don't know. And poor Caroline was distraught. She was crying like, oh,
yeah, because all these 40, 50-year-old guys are acting like idiots and banging on pots, and she's hooting and hollering and peeking in her windows.
She's crying her eyes out, So I think maybe they felt sorry for her, but the newspaper made fun of him because William Claude Jones was an expert on the Aztec Indians. So they said he was imitating the Aztec and going about the village looking for young maidens and that kind of stuff. So, but I didn't know that because you read this report. You go, what are they talking about? They were talking about William Claude Jones and his wife. That marriage didn't last very long. They ended up leaving.
You're kidding me.
He ends up bolting. He was going down to Tucson.
What, she was too old for him?
Yeah, it could have been. He ends up bolting, I think, but he comes back. They must have divorced or something, and he leaves. He ends up in Hawaii, and makes a name for himself there.
In Hawaii?
He was like a beehan. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, he's a whole other story. But so the Barbarians, they go over to the Quartz Rock. They're celebrating. And apparently, this was a lot of the work was based on mining, and mining was men's work. So the men to female ratio was very different, whatever the word I'm looking for. There was a lot more men.
There was a disparity.
Yeah, there was a big disparity. And they would kind of follow the mining camps. The prostitutes would kind of follow the mining camps because they could get business there. But somehow or another, and I found this, there's a master's thesis in the archives about the history of Fort Whipple, and they tell the story. They found some women, maybe Hardy got them there, but they found some women, and here's the government, Goodwin, and they're dancing with these girls. There was about a dozen women. They danced all night, and they had a good time. And eventually,
I'm sure they did.
The Quartz Rock started advertising, and they advertised every week. They were the first ones I saw with actual pictures in there. And
so I've read something, and you can clarify this, but I forget where it comes from. But I don't know if it was a 4th of July celebration or another celebration, but there was 200 men and 40 women at this event or something.
Oh, you're thinking of, I'm going to get, that's Diana.
Oh, that's the Diana. We're getting there now, I think, aren't we?
We're getting there.
We're working our way there.
So the Quartz Rock was the go-to place. The first murder actually occurred there, the first saloon murder in 1867.
Hey, it took 3 years to have a murder in a saloon in Prescott.
At least the first one reported.
Okay, anyway. True. First one reported.
This is 67, and there was a guy in there.
Everybody else had the decency to go outside first?
I guess so. Well, where's the Quartz Rock Saloon? It would have been where today's on Granite Street, the parking garage right next to it's Fancy That. On that lot is where the Quartz Rock was.
Really?
So yeah, it was right on Granite Street, on the east side of Granite Street. Then you had Granite Street, and then the creek was across the way there. So it was close to the creek, and it was probably a clear path.
So the Quartz Rock you didn't have to cross the creek to get to Quartz Rock.
Yeah, you might have if you were on the other side.
Well, maybe if you were in Prescott Plaza proper,
but to get to
you didn't have to cross the creek anymore, so you didn't have to worry about fording the mighty Granite and possibly dying from flood.
And that's probably just one of those legends.
Yeah,
but
it was on this side.
This is what I heard.
It was on this side of the creek.
It was right behind where the palace. So if you're in the palace patio and look over to Fancy That, it's right there. So
it was Whiskey Row adjacent.
Yeah, it was right there. It was eventually where the Red Lake District was. But the first murder, so there's a guy in there, and his name happened to be William Murray. So who do I think of? Was Bill Murray, Bill Murray was there.
Yeah. William
Murray was playing cards, and in walks this soldier from California, and his name was George Crafts.
Oh, I thought you were going to say Dan Aykroyd.
Yeah, I don't know. Belushi, I don't know. Yeah. I'm going to stop doing Caddyshack. But George Crafts walks in, and he just wanted to cause trouble, probably drinking. And he was interrupting the card game. Well, William Murray wasn't going to take that, and he stands up, and Crafts draws a gun on him. Well, William Murray didn't have a gun, but the guy next to him did. So just like in an old Western movie, where you see him grab a gun he grabs the gun from the guy next to him, pulls the trigger, misfire, nothing. Pulls the trigger again, it blows up in his hand, and Crafts shoots him right in the heart, and he's dead. And he kills him immediately. Just like that, he was gone. So, and Crafts apparently came from a well-to-do family, and the newspaper report says something like, boy, they're going to really be disappointed in their son. But he was arrested. But here's the funny thing about the reports at that time. Report talks about, oh, poor Bill Murray. He left a family behind. And the very last line of the report, it goes, and he left an interesting wife behind.
An interesting wife?
And he just left it there. I'm going, what were they thinking? Here's our chance to get at Bill Murray's wife.
Let's drag the widow through the mud.
Yeah, how do you read into that, So why would you call her
interesting?
Not a wife, an interesting wife behind.
Yeah, that's one thing about the papers of the era when you're doing research. there's hidden jokes in there. There's innuendos. There's half truths. It's sometimes really hard to figure out what they're alluding to because they'd say things that if you were there and living there at the time, you'd get.
You'd have to be an insider.
Yeah, they're all inside comments.
Yep. So that's where we are with that. So the Quartz Rock Saloon lasted until 1871. Guess what happened to it?
Burned down.
Everybody say it. Every time I mention that in a presentation, guess what happened to it? Burned down. It burned down. It was actually the first major fire, I think. The Juniper House, guess what happened to it?
Did it burn down?
It burned down. But that was this.
So I'm assuming the quartz rock was not made out of quartz rock.
It was a log. It was log.
It was log also?
Just a log, a little bit bigger. It actually had, at one point, it had 2 pool tables. So it was a little more spacious than 12 by 15.
Very cosmopolitan.
Yeah. And that was a big thing, playing the billiard table.
Billiards.
They called it at the time. But yeah, it burned down. So what happened was a bartender there, his name was Andrew Moeller. And
I know that name.
He ends up, Moeller Street. So everybody who's familiar in Prescott knows Moeller Street's named after him. What would that be? A little north of?
It's like 2-3 blocks north of Sheldon.
Yeah. So Moeller must have made good tips. They call him Dr. Moeller for some reason, but there's no indication he was actually an actual. They call him Doc for whatever reason. I don't know. He was actually more of a miner, but he must have saved up some money. He bought the Quartz Rock Saloon. But what happened before that? Before the Diana Saloon, before the Quartz Rock burned down, he actually invested in something called the Diana Saloon, which that's a whole other story. Now, the real birth of what today's Whiskey Row looks like comes with the Diana Saloon. And it started with a guy named Albert Noyes. He was a pioneer. He had the Quartz Mountain Sawmill, so he was a builder as well. And he announced in town that he was going to build this big old 2-story building, and it was going to be like 3,600 square feet, which was mammoth. Yeah, mammoth at the time. I've had some houses that big, but
it sure beats the 150 square feet of the Pine House
of the Juniper House. Yeah, Juniper House, 12 by 15. But and we'll show you pictures on the podcast. But he announces that he's going to start piling lumber on the corner of where Hotel St. Michael is now. So Gurley, Montezuma, southwest corner. He starts piling lumber up, and everybody's going, "Oh, what's going to happen here?" He makes that announcement, so everybody's getting excited. He was building during the monsoon season, and I don't know if he just wasn't familiar with what could happen, but at one point there was we were talking about Granite Creek raging. Well, at this point it did. Well, we've seen it with those big monsoon rains. If they're big ones, boy, it can be those flash floods. So a big monsoon rain hit, and Noyes Quartz Sawmill was on Granite, and a lot of the lumber he had prepared for this building got washed away.
Oh, wow.
And he went back to it, and he got more lumber. Then he starts putting the building up with his workers on the corner there where St. Michael is. And the frame is basically there. What happens? Another huge monsoon rain hits, but this one had the wind, knocks it over. So they're from scratch. And the newspaper report, they showed up Monday morning going, I don't know if it's a Monday morning. I'm thinking of how I showed up to work on Monday mornings. But they showed up the next day and saw that, and they were so dejected, but they got back to work. And I think it was by October they had the thing built.
Wow.
And Noyes was going to make it into a saloon, but he decides to sell it to Moeller. And Moeller buys it. So at the time, this is 1868, Moeller had the Quartz Rock, and he had the Diana Saloon. So he had a monopoly really on, not so much, there were some other saloons, but
on the popular ones.
He had the 2 major saloons there. So, but before that, they just called it Moeller's Building. So we'll get to the Thanksgiving, what you were talking about there. So people were excited. We got this big building now. We can do some stuff. So Thanksgiving's rolling around. This is 68. Moeller's Building was ready. He said, how about we hold a Thanksgiving ball? And they do. And it was a huge event. the night, Thanksgiving night, they had actually had the dinner somewhere else. And then there was a dance at the Moeller's Hall. It wasn't named the Diana at that point. It didn't have a name for
And
it
just
yet.
and just to reiterate for people who aren't overly familiar, so Moeller's Hall, which would become the Diana, is where Hotel St. Michael's is now, on the corner of Whiskey Row.
Right.
The anchor of Whiskey Row, as I think they call it.
And this the mother. I call it the mother of Whiskey Row, and Moeller the father of Whiskey Row, because he had the Quartz Rock and the Diana. But so Thanksgiving night rolls around, and there was quite a dance, and the Minor Center reporter, I think it was John Marion, the owner editor, I think actually went there and made a report. But he got there, and there were about 160 men and 40 women.
I'm actually surprised they were able to find 40 women.
40 women by this time, and in the report, a lot of them were married, so they weren't available. They weren't available. He put it, their hearts weren't for sale or something like that. But
for the other women, apparently their hearts were for sale by default.
And maybe there was some paying going on. But
may have been.
There was a report that some of the men were jealous. They couldn't get a dance. There was one in particular that everybody wanted to dance with, and they couldn't. And the Biters guys are sitting there watching all this. He said it was so packed, though, they had to stand in a corner because their toes were getting stepped on. So that was a success. And then by December, the saloon opens up to a grand opening. That was big. And
is it named the Diana at that point?
Not yet. Not that I know of, anyway.
And this is December 1868.
And this was a result, December 1868. The oldest known photo of Prescott, we'll show that. We'll put that on here. You could see the Diana.
All by its lonesome.
And it had some buildings attached, but the rest of Whiskey Row, it wasn't there yet. So we think the photo is 69, but we'll show that one. But it stands out. And even in that photo, you can look, and it was taken from probably where the Pioneers' home is, the picture. And you look down, you can see people standing out in the front. They didn't know their picture was getting taken. So it was the place to go. The Quartz Rock was still right behind. So they were really close to each other. Then the Quartz Rock burns down.
And when did that burn down?
And so that was 71.
So he had both for several years.
For a while. Yeah, for a while. I forget exactly when. It was not long that he bought it, maybe 65, 66. He might have bought it. But Moeller ends up being a property magnate. I did some calculations of all the places he owned. And by today's standard, renting property, he was making $22,000 a month.
In today's money.
And I forget what that goes back to. I just remember it was $22,000. So he was making a lot of money.
And that's just on rental properties. That's not his saloon business.
Yeah, he was buying stuff.
Yeah.
He was selling lots, and he was
doing well. Mr. Moeller was doing well.
He was the mover and shaker. Yeah. And we'll show you a picture of him, but he ends up going mental. He ends up going insane. His is a whole nother story. But so the Diana is there. And now they're adding to this Whiskey on Montezuma Street. They're adding buildings, adding saloons. It's becoming a row. And it wasn't until probably 1874 or so. My guess is that's when they started calling it Whiskey Row, because the cabinet comes along.
Because you didn't have a row until that point.
Yeah, it was
Whiskey building.
Hit and miss. And we'll show you a picture. Eventually by 1874, late 1870s, a row had formed. And so when Doc Holliday got here, Wyatt Earp got here, there was a row, so and the Diana was at the head of it. Now we want to get to Cabinet Saloon.
The cabinet, the spiritual predecessor of the palace.
That's a good way of putting it.
It is. It truly is the spiritual predecessor.
Yeah, because
the bones, the palace is built on the bones of the cabinet.
Yeah, because and when
that's poetic.
Early, there was a couple. I noticed there were a couple of researchers who go, "Hey, the cabinet might have been the palace," but no one really researched it. But I'll jump to the punchline, as it were. When the palace and the cabinet burned down in 1900, eventually the owners of the cabinet and the owner, Bob Brow, of the palace, they bought 3 lots where the palace is today, and they merged their
interests,
their businesses, and they were going to call it. Let's just talk about how that happened. So Thorne in
DC Thorne.
DC
What did DC
Thorne.
stand for?
Daniel Connor.
Daniel Connor Thorne.
Daniel Connor Thorne.
The founder of the Cabinet Saloon.
We could say that because the roots trace back to DC Thorne. DC Thorne, when he stood there in 1901, he was still around. He could look at the palace and go, that started with me, because they were going to name it. At one point, they were going to name it the Palace Cabinet. At least it was being called that. Then they were going to name it the National Saloon. On the blueprint,
it actually says national.
It says national. It's crossed out. This is the back of the original blueprint. You can actually see where it's National Saloon crossed out. Oops, Palace.
So that was really a last minute decision to call it the Palace.
And that's why it's, for earlier researchers, why it was so hard to trace the roots to, because they were focused on that word palace, not remembering that it was actually the two saloons that were put together. But anyway, Thorne.
Early mid 1870s, DC Thorne decides
1874.
Decides to buy a lot and build a saloon.
Mm-hmm. And apparently he'd already bought lot 19. He owned it for some time. He opens up a saloon with a guy named Hutchison, not related to the Birdcage Theater Hutchison in Tombstone. But he opens it up. It's announced that this is going to be the new place to go. And Thorne, a little bit about him. He was a real character. He's my favorite character, Whiskey Row character, historically, because he was a force of nature guy. He drew a crowd unto himself, and he was innovator. He was always doing something to improve the cabinet, to make it the place to go to. He had actually had a cockpit,
like an airplane cockpit.
Rooster. Yeah, he had a. Wright brothers came along and
he had cockfighting.
Yeah, he had cockfighting there on the roof because he had a restaurant in the back. So that was big. And again, Tucson was mentioned. And go, ha ha, we're bad boys too. We got cockfighting right here in Prescott. Yeah. And there was only 2 separate events, but they were huge events. And it was reported like a boxing match. This rooster did this.
In the blue corner.
Yeah.
We have Foghorn Leghorn.
It was a TKO at one point. And Connor apparently had the baddest roosters around, so that was a big thing.
So lot 19. Lot 19. In modern parlances, that would be the north third of the existing palace. So where I think is that
Kickapoo Express?
Kickapoo Express. So in the palace, in the actual palace stone building, when you're looking at it from the outside, the actual saloon is in the middle. Then you have the south side is a art gallery of some sort, and the north side is another art gallery of some sort. And we believe it's Kickapoo Express.
I think so.
That was lot 19, and that's where the cabinet started.
Right. So so today the back end of the Palace to Bill Owens room is
Bill
lot 19.
Owens loan is lot.
So that's where his the dining room, but the restaurant portion would have been for the cabinet. So he's on that lot 19, and you can look at the palace when you look at the palace. Look, the saloon was actually where a bathhouse was, and I swear
modern saloon.
Yeah, the modern saloon. Yeah, the modern saloon today. Let's back up a little bit.
Yeah, we're getting ahead.
So what happened was Thorne built the cabinet
on lot 19.
In lot 19. So that becomes, according to Lily Fremont, John Fremont's daughter, she wrote in her diary that Dan Thorne owns the premier faro spot in town. And it's funny because she had to justify. He goes, he does that, but he's a really nice guy, and to make sure he's a nice guy.
And this is the daughter of the governor, Fremont, the governor of the territory,
who was here more than he was.
Yeah, she was here more than he was. Exactly.
He said, here I got it right here. Dan Thorne keeps the chief faro and gambling place in the village, but it is nevertheless a good citizen.
A good citizen.
Yeah, that was badness was associated with saloons and card playing and gambling and that kind of thing. But and he actually was a citizen who participated in local affairs a lot. He was quite a guy, but so his saloon is there on lot 19. Whiskey Row's growing. I think you could kind of trace back to the 1874 when the cabinet opened, where they started calling it Whiskey Row. But the cabinet, Dan Thorne attracted people. He was just one of those guys. And but in June 1883, something happens on Goodwin Street. Let's back up a little bit, because you see it's not on there anymore because the sign got changed in front of the historical marker, got changed to the true story that we're talking about today. We'll put that on there. But on the original sign, it was believed.
Now, you're talking about the sign on the palace today.
On the palace.
On the outside of the palace.
And you still see serving rough customers since 1877. And they've used that date, 1877, because in 1877, like you and I have both looked at, there was a palace.
A different palace.
And
we actually covered that palace when we talked about Virgil Earp and Prescott a couple episodes ago.
But it has nothing to do. So what happened when the researchers did that? Probably like me, they would go looking for the palace in the research. No palace. All of a sudden, 1877, September, there's a little blurb. Wiley Standifer and Gilman Shaw are opening the palace. And the researchers, and I kind of did too. I go, oh, there
it's done.
Is.
Case closed.
Yeah, there it is. Because they described it, sound like the palace. And that's where we think Virgil Earp was when they found him and he got on this posse and they shot the hell out of him.
But that's not our palace.
It's not our palace.
Our palace starts in 83.
83. So that palace didn't last very long, but people looked at that and go, that's it. That's 1870. We found it. But I kept going. And all of a sudden there was another palace in 82 run by a Mrs. McManus. It was down below Arts Prescott Gallery where Jackson Tompkins was, and it didn't last very long. But it went out of business. In 83, Al Whitney and Nathan Ellis both ended up serving in Congress. Actually tried to get established in Tombstone as well, and they ended up buying the Diana Saloon. So at the time, in 83, they owned the Diana Saloon, but they wanted more. On Goodwin Street, a hotel went up that was going to be the finest in Prescott's history, the Sherman House, first-class hotel. And
for those, again, who aren't overly familiar, the Sherman block, the Sherman House, was on the south side of the plaza where the Executive Realty is and the Chamber of Commerce is now. Right. And where the old 1930s post office is. That block right there was the Sherman block, and that's where the first palace.
The palace would have been in the chamber where the I always mention, where Wendy works, my wife, realty executives. That's where the palace was, and people are going, we don't know where your wife works. But it was in that area right there with the chamber. And the palace went up, it opened, and big
fanfare.
Big fanfare. And 2 weeks after it opened, starting at the cabinet, the northern third of what is now Whiskey Row burned down all the way up to Diana. Cabinet burned down, Diana burned down.
So the entire north half of Whiskey Row burned down.
Right, pretty much.
In 83.
Probably not a half, but close to it. So
all the big stores. So all the big saloons.
Yeah. So what was considered Whiskey Row, because they said that's where we see Whiskey Row burned down. So that's what was probably considered Whiskey Row at the time. But now the cabinet's gone. Lot 19's open. Diana's Saloon's gone. And the palace opens 2 weeks before, so they're getting all the business. Guess what happens to the palace on Goodwin
Let me
Street?
guess. Did it burn down?
What happened is you're going to be surprised.
It didn't burn down.
It burned down. The Sherman House burned down. Same reason. When the cabinet burned down, it was called the defective flue with the oven. Same thing happened with the Sherman House, defective flue. Richard Elliott's house, where Doc Holliday lived, burned down, defective flue. So
I'm sensing there should have been a recall.
Should have been a recall. They didn't get they got all the junk mail.
Yeah.
And it just go there. It's just another piece.
It's just exactly more junk mail.
So it burns down.
You too can be a winner.
Yeah. So the palace burns down. Now Ellis and Whitney just lost the Diana. They lost the palace. You still got this burned out area on the northern half of Montezuma Street below Gurley. Should they rebuild? They do rebuild, but they take lot 19 where
the cabinet was.
Yeah. Cabinet's not rebuilt yet. And they build there. And this time they do a stone and brick and iron because enough is enough. So
it's a fireproof saloon.
Yeah.
Brick and iron.
It's not going to ever burn down.
Never. It will never burn down.
St. Michael, it's never going to burn down. It's fireproof. You
exactly. We'll get there.
The bricks survived.
Yeah.
You got to hand it to the bricks.
We'll get there. Spoiler alert, the palace burns down.
Yeah, if you didn't know. So, and then Thorne ends up eventually rebuilding 2 lots down on
Thorne being the owner of the cabinet.
Right. Thorne
So
owns
you
the
have
cabinet.
you have the palace moving to where the cabinet was, which is where I always mess up the name. Kickapoo Express is, and then the cabinet is now on the other side of the saloon area of the main palace building of today.
And
there's a vacant lot between them.
Yeah, and then there's Well, I don't know. It might have been vacant at the time. Yeah. So eventually that became a bathhouse. So we will show a picture with the palace, the bathhouse, and the
yes.
And I was going to say,
and the bathhouse is now the main saloon room of the palace.
When I found that out, I swear to you, you know how the mind works.
Yeah.
I'd be sitting in there in the saloon going, I smell bathhouse things.
I smell bath salts.
Yes, it was in my nose. But and that middle lot became a joint use area, and the back end was a dining room. But it changed over time. So eventually,
so do you think you could actually walk like a side door from the palace or the cabinet into the bathhouse? So you wouldn't have to go outside? I'm guessing
maybe that's
well,
true.
that would make sense. I mean, you come into the saloon, you have a couple drinks, you wait for your turn of the tub, you would wash up, and you're nice and clean, and you come back in and drink some more.
Press the button.
Yeah, press the button.
Okay.
So we're not going to talk about that.
We'll get that out there.
All right. So now you have what everybody remembers as historic Whiskey Row. You have the palace going south, you have the palace, you have the bathhouse, and then you have the cabinet.
Right.
All on what the lot is now that we consider the palace building.
So 3 lots, all of them 125 feet wide and 100 some feet long, 150 maybe. Yeah. So that all the way up to 1900. So the palace and the cabinet they're just the places. They're the best places in the territory to go. And but Brow, who owned the palace, Robert Brow owned the palace, and Barney Smith and Ben Belcher, they become buddies. So let's just move ahead. And there's some interesting history. We'll show some pictures of there because you can see palace, bathhouse, cabinet, real plain sight. Palace had brick and iron. Cabinet was still in wood, as was the bathhouse. So
spoiler alert, the cabinet burned down.
And we're going to do a whole show
on the fire.
Yeah, we're going to have a whole show on the fire.
We probably could do a whole show just on the cabinet palace.
Oh, easily. And because, the palace is still there, that's why it's important to the history.
Exactly.
And, we'll end with St. Michael a little bit, some brief history. So the fire, everybody knows what happened. Won't go into that, but they're dynamiting places along the way, and it just gets worse and worse. They can't stop the fire. They get up to the cabinet. Guy runs.
We're talking about the 1900 fire.
The 1900 fire. So after the 1884 fire, when the palace burned down, except there was a fire inside the palace, which we can get to. Probably talk about that with the fire, Whiskey Row fire. 1900, the fire's moving north. They're dynamiting places. One of the places chosen to dynamite was the cabinet saloon, and they had an ice box like the one you see in the palace today. And guy runs in there and he says, Barney Smith sees the guy with the dynamite. He says, "What you going to do with that?" He goes, "I'm going to blow up your place." He goes, "Well, where are you going to put it?" "I'm going to put it in your ice box." He goes, "Geez, that's bad for the ice box." And they had a cabinet. I don't know if it's called the cabinet of that, but they had a cabinet with these splendid ore specimens that was real valuable. So Barney Smith gets out of there. There's a story where I think Barney left his coat on some chair or something like that, and had a bunch of money in it to it. And he's watching his place go up, and he's going, "Oh, I forgot my money," but we didn't want to run back in there. They blow it up, gets worse. The palace is made of stone and brick and iron, and so they figured, don't dynamite it, hoping it would stop the fire. But the bricks survived, but it was so intense that they crumpled, and it goes on up to the what was called Hotel Burke, which was now St. Michael, but it was the fireproof hotel. You're talking about fire, absolutely fireproof, and it went down in
like a matchbox.
5-10 minutes. Yeah. And some of the brick today at St. Michael's, you can see survived the fire because you got these boys just clean them up, and they stacked them, and they reused a lot of them.
So the palace, I do want to go back to this because I find this, because 4th of July, for those of you who don't know, and most of you, anybody who lives here already knows, this 4th of July is really big in Prescott. We have Frontier Days. We have a week long of rodeo and celebrations and saloons, and it's a big party for a week. The palace is always part of that celebration. It's the hub of Frontier Days down on Whiskey Row. But when the palace burned down on the Sherman block over on Goodwin, and it moved to Lot 19 on Whiskey Row, where it is now, it reopened on the 4th of July of 1884.
Right.
So 4th of July is always Palace Day.
Right. It's again, much fanfare. Bands were playing everything, but there was all kinds of. There was just a huge celebration everywhere. And but the story behind that is that it was Barney Smith and Ben Belcher of the Cabinet, Robert Brow of the Palace. They decided to at some point merge. They buy
after the fire.
So they set up their temporary businesses on the plaza. They end up buying, and there's another Tombstone connection I want to tell you about. They end up buying 3 lots from Hugh McCrum, who actually has strong connections with Tombstone. I just found out, but and apparently I think they bought the 3 lots for like $7,000, which was a steal, like for a song. And that's where the palace sits today. Like I said, they were going to call it different names. Eventually settled on the palace because you know what it looks like? It looks like a palace.
It does look like a palace.
And there was a hotel above there. And and I haven't researched the palace after the fire.
Now we all know, we've all seen the picture of the Tent City Whiskey Row after the fire. So after the Great Fire of 1900, everybody on Whiskey Row pulled what they could out of the fires and out of their buildings, and they set up a tent city across the street on the Courthouse Plaza.
Right.
And there's that famous photo of the tent with a sign that says Bob Brow Saloon and proud of it.
Yeah, and that was actually one of the few wooden structures right there. And the Cabinet built bigger, but they had a tent like.
I was going to ask you, did the Cabinet? I've never seen a picture of the Cabinet.
So the Cabinet actually established.
Tent City Cabinet.
Yeah, the Tent City Cabinet actually established itself right across from the palaces. Now the palace itself was like a little farther south, so they were a few doors away from each other. But at some point, they decided to get together. They were rebuilding separately at first, or at least getting ready for it.
But DC Thorne did have a tent saloon across the street also.
Thorne was gone.
Oh, he was gone already.
Thorne's already out.
But the Cabinet had a tent saloon. I need to find a picture of that.
I can give it to you. Oh, it's on the fire.
And so then they that's 1900, July of 1900, the Great Fire. And then within days after the fire, they are busy, building, rebuilding. They build. They're going to build this massive structure. They're going to call it the Cabinet Palace. They're going to call it the National. Then they decide on the palace again, and that's the palace that we have today.
Right.
So I know we're getting long in the hour. I want to talk about the St. Michael and the history. We started with the Diana Saloon. And I want to, if we could have 5 minutes of
and you thought we'd go 45 minutes.
I thought we'd go 45 minutes. I was wrong.
I get what you underestimated.
But okay, so where the St. Michael is today, we had the Diana Saloon there as of 1868.
Right.
So tell me about it.
Then 83 it burns down.
83 it burns down in the first Whiskey Row fire.
And I found one picture where the lot was empty, but a place called the Little Diana was put there. It wasn't until 1892 when Dennis Burke, Michael Hickey, and guess who? Bucky O'Neill built was Hotel Burke. And it was eventually 3 stories. 92, it was 94, it was 2 stories. It was the premier hotel in all of Arizona. 94, they added another story. So when you look at the pictures, you can see sometimes it's 2 stories, then 3 stories.
And you can date it by that.
Yeah. And when we're going to do a whole thing on the fire, but
the fireproof Burke burns down.
Yeah, I remember sitting in the archives in front of the microfilm machine there and coming across ads by the Hotel St. Michael. The only absolutely fireproof place. And I knew what had happened. I started laughing. The guy next to me, what are you laughing at? Because I know what happened to this thing. Spoiler alert, it burned down. And it just crumbles. And I'll probably throw in a picture for this. The picture of the Hotel Burke burning down it's amazing.
I've seen it.
Yeah. You feel the heat from the picture.
Yeah, the picture is amazing.
So
it burns down, and then they end up building, in 1900, they built the St. Michael.
They built Well, it was still called Hotel Burke.
It was.
And Burke eventually, he dies younger, but he eventually sold his interest to Michael Hickey. And somehow they come up with the name. I think it was like 1908 when it was switched to the name, but it's the same building. Yeah.
So the Burke actually existed in name until 1908 or so.
Yeah. And exactly. And I met one of the relatives, Dennis Burke. He sent me some interesting stuff. I think his name was Dennis. But to St. Michael, I got to say, they're doing some amazing stuff right now.
I think we need to do an episode on the St. Michael and the Diana, that lot.
Yeah.
We need to do a story on that lot.
We could. Yeah,
easily.
We could.
All right. I do. It's been an hour. I don't want to go, but I think we have to.
We want to keep talking.
I want to keep that. We could be here. Unfortunately for everybody, we could be here for like 3 days talking. Thank you all for watching. Thank you for listening. Again, this is Bradley G. Courtney, the Whiskey Row historian. I'm Ron Williams, the Prescott Constable. Thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. If you liked it, tune in next time. If you didn't like it, we're getting better every time. We're really trying. Thank you.